Hello and welcome to Myths, Mysteries, and More. Today, we're going to be talking about Faust. Before I do that, though, I just want to say that if you're listening to this on Podbean, you can also listen to this on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, you can listen to this on Podbean. I'm hoping to get this podcast on more services, but for now, those are the two main places where I host this. In any case, let's start getting on to Faust itself. So I think most people already have a vague idea of what Faust is, or what it's about, because most people understand what a Faustian bargain is. Most people understand that it has something to do with making a deal with Satan. Usually it's implied that this is a bad idea. It's one of the biggest stories that I think gets retold in English, despite being a German story. It's one of those stories where, even if it's not being told directly, it's often referenced or used as a base for lots of other stories. I will say that when I started doing research for this episode, I didn't realize how many different versions of this story there were. I was only really familiar with Goethe's Faust. I was not familiar with the many, many other versions that have been told and retold over the centuries. Because one of the interesting things is that it's been told and retold so many times that it's been in almost every genre. Like, it's been a comedy, it's been a tragedy, it's been a play, it's been a novel, it's been, like, made for children, it's made for adults. It is so many things. And I was not expecting that. Most stories that I'm familiar with, especially ones that are based on mythology of some kind, whether it be folklore or what have you, don't have this many different versions. Usually what you get is a version of the story that we think is the original one that was written down after being orally told for a very long time. You get translations, which can be creative in how they translate things. That might lose some cultural contexts. You might have somebody later reinterpret the story based on their own motives. Very rarely do you have a situation like Faust where it is everything to everyone at some point. It has been political commentary, it has been social commentary, it has been comedy for children, it has been a play for the rich elite, it has been everything to everyone. And this has only gotten more complex as modernity came into its own and we developed new forms of entertainment, including movies and television. This has become even more complex because Faust was a real guy. And you also don't normally see that. You don't normally see all this mythology written about a dude who we knew was alive that's not like a religious figure. Normally, you only get this kind of thing if you're written about in some form of religion. You don't normally get folklore written about a real dude who lived in the real world that we can actually date to being alive. But I guess that's a good thing. So, what we're going to do is I'm first going to talk about him, the real guy, and then I'm going to go through the stories, and I'll probably talk about their differences, but I'm going to start with the oldest version that we have. So with all that said, who was John Faustus? Who was Johann Georg Faust, as his original name was in German? Well, we know for a fact that he was born somewhere between 1466 and 1480. Give or take, 20 years in there. We're not exactly sure because, well, birth dates are not particularly good the further back you go. Mostly because they used a number of different calendars, and I'm just going to assume that that's mostly accurate. We do know that he died in 1541, because if nothing else, people kept very good records of when people died, just not when they were born. Now, he was a German, as his name probably sounds. You don't see many English people being named Johann. But in any case, he was a doctor of sorts. He was mostly known for being a chemist. He was known to be an alchemist. He was interested in astrology, which is not altogether abnormal. You have to remember, this is the early Renaissance. This is an age where lots of men are doing things and calling themselves doctors, but what they really are is just like mad scientists putting chemicals together and seeing what happens. The level of sophistication is not particularly high, and most of these doctors did not know what the hell they were doing. So it's not really surprising that Johann got a reputation for being less than great at his job. Because then again, most people who were in this line of work generally weren't very good at their job. What's notable is that the stories about him started circulating almost immediately after his death. The earliest version that we have that mentions him as any kind of folklore was in the 1580s, and the earliest play that we have is from 1604. So we know that he was notable enough that his story almost immediately became well known around those that could read. The real problem, of course, is that because he was so quickly moved into the realm of folklore, actually knowing about him, the man, is very hard. Because again, most of the sources around him were kind of subsumed into, like, mythology almost. In any case, there were plenty of people, even in centuries after his death, who didn't actually believe he was a real man, because obviously if all of your sources refer to him in near mythological terms, you're not going to assume that this man actually lived. This is no different than us wondering for a very long time if things like Troy existed. Obviously later on we found out that Troy was a real thing, that there was a real place called Troy, and we know where it is, and we saw the outlines of the city. But again, it's not all that surprising that lots of people were doubting that he existed, given his heavy presence in various stories about him. There's also a bunch of other stuff that make this very complicated, because we don't actually know what his real first name was, so normally when he's referred to, they use both of them. So for example, most people will refer to him as Johann Georg Faust. And that's because we have two different birth certificates, or birth records of him, I should say. One which says his first name is Johann, and one which says his first name is Georg. Also, they're from two separate dates. I mentioned before that he was born somewhere between 1466 and 1480, and that's because these two documents give him a birth year of 20 years apart. It's also worth noting that they have two separate places of origin, so who knows where he was born either. Now, what's really complicated about this is that they both ended up calling themselves Faustus, and no one is really certain which is the one referred to in the story. So, it's possible that they are both him, that they became one person through folklore, that the deeds of one or both of them got meshed together. But what we do know is that there were at least one guy named Johann Faust, or Georg Faust, who became a person. He was a real person. Now, I hear some people going, well, hold on a moment. How do you know he was a real person if we already have disputed records about which of these guys was actually Faust? Well, we know he was real, or at least there was a guy named Faust, even if one or both or neither of these guys were the guy we're referring to, because we have archives of Faust in government, because Faust worked for the government in various capacities. Now, the earliest that we have that refers to anyone by the name Faust specifically that I could find is in 1506. Because in 1506, in the town of Glenhausen, there was a man named Faust who apparently showed up in town and was performing various magical effects. He was reading horoscopes. he was doing things which in an earlier age would have gotten you burned at the stake. Unsurprisingly, the church hated this and wanted him to be excommunicated as a blasphemer, as a devil worshiper, as doing horrible, horrible things. It's also worth noting that he was also recorded all over the place in southern Germany by this name. So it's probably likely that this was some kind of stage name of some kind, which is how everyone knows him. What's interesting is that in the records we have, he's listed as all kinds of things, like not just as a guy who does magic and alchemy and stuff. No, he's a doctor, he's a philosopher, he's an astrologer. He is so many things. He is listed as being so many things. And it's interesting that he's often also called a fraud, which makes sense because it would be kind of hard to be literally everything and not be a fraud. Like, any one of these disciplines requires a lifetime of training at this point. And to claim that you are good at all of them and a master of all of them means that you're probably a master of none of these. One of the more interesting stories that comes out around this time that I find particularly unique is that in various letters, a man is described calling himself Faust, who is not just like an alchemist or quack doctor, but is actively promoting the idea that he has evil demonic powers. Because he's described as someone who is walking around claiming that he can reproduce all of the miracles that Jesus performed. Which is kind of wild because it's the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. It's 1507, and yet a guy is wandering around apparently claiming that he can do everything Jesus can do. He can turn water into wine, he can walk on water. Now, I will point out that I don't know how true this is. Again, I don't know if he was actually doing this, because the guy who wrote the letters that we have alleging all of this also alleged that he was a teacher of some kind who was engaging in sodomy and then fleeing once he did these things. Now, I want to point out that accusations of witchcraft and sodomy against opponents who were doing things you didn't like was commonplace. If you wanted to allege that somebody was a devil worshiper or engaging in impious acts, you would often tack on lots of other things. So, if you want to allege that, say, for your example, your wife was being, infertile, you would also, charge her with witchcraft and infidelity and a whole bunch of other stuff. And this went for men, too. So, it was completely normal for it's like, I don't like this guy, and he's a fraud, and also he's a sodomite. Just add more charges to the list, because why? Why not? There's no reason not to constantly add more charges. So I don't know if he was actually a teacher engaging in sodomy in 1507. That could just be a rumor by this guy who had an axe to grind. I don't know. We have another claim a few years later by a guy who claims that he met a man named Faustus in a bar who was claiming that he was a demigod. I have no idea if that's accurate, but it's what is recorded. Years later, in 1520, we have a record from the church that he was hired to do a horoscope for the bishop. Now, I don't know if it was the same guy, but it was a man named Faust. That's what's on the record. 8 years later, in 1528, we know that he was in a town called Ingolstadt. I think that's how you pronounce that, because we have records that he was banished from the town by name. And then again, in 1523, we know that he was at least attempting to enter the town of Nuremberg, because the mayor of the city wrote a deliberate letter saying that you need to not let this man in because he's a devil worshiper and also a sodomite. Because again, if you don't like somebody, just tag on the term sodomite, and that does enough. Now then, you may notice that most of these are extraordinarily negative, which doesn't surprise me, and it probably shouldn't surprise you, given the fact of his profession. What's interesting is that close to the time that he dies, we have a bunch of records of people talking about him in a positive light, which is very confusing. So, for example, in 1536, we have at least one guy talking about him as being a respectable and good astrologer, which kind of seems odd today. And somebody in 1539 was talking about him being a good doctor, which is kind of confusing. Now, beyond that, we don't know when exactly he died. We have a rough concept that he died somewhere in 1540 or 1541. I don't know which, and no one else really does either. The record is kind of conflicting. Now, what we do know is ostensibly what he died from. And once you're told this, it probably comes into focus a bit more as to why people thought he was in league with the devil. Because supposedly, he died in an explosion. Allegedly, what happened was he was performing an alchemical experiment of some kind, some sort of mystical experiment, and he exploded. Or should I say, the building exploded. And when he was found, he was horribly mutilated. Which is not surprising, because he was in an explosion. Generally speaking, if you are very close to an explosion, your body does not survive intact. In any case, the people at the time basically went, well, the weird astrologer magician guy was in a building and the building exploded, so clearly this means that Satan showed up to collect him in person. As you can imagine, that was a story that all the people who hated him immediately went with. And there was no shortage of them, as you can probably imagine by all of the stories I've told you so far. Now, after he died, lots of enterprising theologians and various church members wrote lots of stories about what happened to him after his death. So, for example, in one particularly vivid account, it was said that his body refused to face the sky after death. So normally, you bury bodies face up. Supposedly, he was so evil that no matter how many times they tried to make it so he would be buried face up, his body on its own flipped over so that it was face down. Now, it may be worth taking this with a grain of salt, because this same author also wrote that at some time later, he met Faust alive and on Earth, again after his death, during which time Faust apparently demanded that the cook cook some kind of strange bird, and that he traveled with a dog and a horse, and that the dog would turn into a man, and it just never stops to amaze me that lots of the wildest stories we have about various folklore comes from theologians who sound like they're insane. Keep in mind, these are people who are in church and who are responsible with understanding the Bible, and yet they spend a lot of their time writing about things that are obviously insane. This ends all of our sort of historical sources, or at least the ones that we might call accurate. I'm not saying that the stuff that was attributed to him actually happened. What I am saying is that the various sources that we have can be attributed to the time by people who were clearly there, and whether or not they made stuff up or not is not the important part in determining whether or not they are actually historical to the people who were there. I mention this primarily because, as I said earlier, lots of people after Faust's death began just making stuff up about him. This is when he kind of transitions from a weirdo who's wandering around Germany to a subject of various people's folklore and ire. So, for example, we have one source that says that Faust claimed that all of the victories by the German emperor when his wars in Italy were due to Faust's magical intervention. We have a source that claims that at one point he was in Venice, and that during which time he claimed that he could fly, only for Satan himself to throw him back to the ground when he tried. We have a source later that claims that he was arrested because he recommended that the local priest use arsenic to get rid of his beard. As you can imagine, when the priest smeared arsenic all over his face, his skin came off too, and supposedly the recounter got the antidote from the victim. We have claims roughly 60 years after Faust dies from people who supposedly knew him, but given the life expectancy at the time, I'm not sure that there was anyone still alive who wasn't like a child or an infant who could have possibly known Faust 60 years later. It's really impossible after he dies to know what is fact and what is fiction, because we no longer have anything that records him doing things himself. So all of this could be hearsay, all of this could be, entirely made up. It could be made up for various reasons by political enemies. It could be made up by people trying to make a buck. You never know. In any case, what we do know is that he was, again, a real person. He engaged in various acts, and he made a lot of enemies doing this. It's also worth noting that there were lots of people who immediately attempted to cash in on him, both when he was alive and when he was not alive. Because you see, people began to publish various manuscripts and books that were supposedly attributed to him, but which were not. Many of these involved witchcraft, many of these involved magic. Because you see, if you have somebody who is rumored to be a wizard or a witch, then you produce a fake pamphlet or a book, and you slap his name on it, and you sell it to people. It's worth noting that they were doing this up until around the 1800s, which isn't very surprising because as long as the early scientific community was still interested in alchemy, there would always be a room for people who were interested in the supposedly famous Dr. Faust. Now, it's worth noting that obviously he's not the only one who fits into this category, but he's probably one of the most famous people who fits into this category, just because the mythology of who he was has mixed into the reality of who he was. But I think that's enough about the history of Dr. Faust, the man. So let's talk about Dr. Faust, the story. So, the first and earliest version of the story that we have is a play by a guy named Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe, obviously by his name, was not German. He was British. And what he did is he took some German folklore and wrote a play that was roughly an amalgamation of a bunch of different stories. The play was entitled The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus, which is a perfectly Elizabethan name for a play like this. It was later shortened just to Dr. Faustus, because that rolls off the tongue a whole lot better. It's worth noting that there are two separate versions of this play, and they have different texts, at least at the end. We have the A version and the B version, depending on which you're using. The original is the A text. That is the one that comes from an earlier version. At some point it was reprinted. It's actually the shorter of the two. The B text is altered slightly. It is longer by several lines, and it's been altered by several people, so we don't really know who. It is also the one that has been reprinted more times. It's more likely that the A text is the original, simply because it is the older text. Professional scholarship has not particularly decided which is the real one, although the common belief today is that they are simply the same text in different versions, with the A text being an abbreviation of the B text. The B text being the expanded version of the original, I guess you could say. However, we don't know if these were all written by Marlowe. We don't know if other people have changed them over time. There have been accusations that that was the case. It's worth noting that the B text has 36 lines that we know of that were removed, but it adds almost 700 new ones. So it is about 1/3 longer than the original. Or I should say the A text, not the original. Beyond this, there are a number of different wording changes and phrasing changes that have been made, and it's kind of unclear how the two texts came about. The most likely answer that we can come up with is that, well, the guy who wrote it doesn't have any control over who performs it and who prints it, because that's not how it was done. Today we like to think of like playwrights being also kind of like directors, but at the time this was not really the case. Most playwrights would write a play, somebody else would get the text and then just kind of run with it. And if you sold your text to a printer, the printer often made their own changes as they felt would make it, more marketable. So for all we know, either one could be accurate, but most people think that the A text was the original and the B text is the one that was changed to make it better / more marketable. Most people who print this version of it print them together. So you get the A text and then you get the B text. I think it's also worth noting that this version, which is the oldest one we have, is not the one that the author was working off of, because the author was working on earlier versions of the story. I already talked about the folklore about the guy who actually lived, but there were other books and other stories that had been printed in Germany about Faust. And it's possible that Marlowe himself, who was a translator, translated somebody else's book and then wrote a play about the book that he had. It's also worth noting that the reason we don't have these things is because very little survived to this day. Various manuscripts and other things that were printed were not printed to last. Most of this stuff was for consumption, and it was not designed to last for centuries and centuries. So we're working off what we have, and we can only really, assume that this is what he did. What we can say for certain is that Marlowe was working off of an already existent story and book. The most likely one that we can think of is something called the History of Johann Faust, which is most likely the one he used. I'm not entirely certain. There are some differences, obviously, because the History of Dr. Faust, as it sounds, is not a play. It is a fiction book written like it was non-fiction. So you have to kind of work with things. Marlowe, the guy who wrote the play, added a bunch of stuff mostly for dramatic effect. He also added a bunch of religious elements. So, for example, in the beginning of the story, Faust talks a lot about religion and science and how attempting to do science is an ultimately vain idea. It introduced concepts like evil angels, which is something that we today see all over the place, but which at the time was fairly new. He was not the only one to do this, but at the time it was kind of like the thing that was in vogue. One other thing is that in the history book, there is a section where Faust is essentially dealing with the 7 deadly sins. Because in the original, one thing that is played up is Faust and his various sins and vices. But because this is a Renaissance-era story, they are replaced with a bunch of essentially random demons and devils. And the reason for this is to emphasize that Faust is an intellectual, that he is curious, rather than openly sinful. Beyond that, the play itself is 5 acts, which is kind of confusing to most modern readers, because we are used to the 3-act structure. Most movies, most television shows, most media in general follows a 3-act structure just because it tends to work best. Plays at this time did not. That is a future invention. So Faust is 5 whole acts long. Obviously, the last act is shortest. That's pretty normal. We also need to mention the fact that monologues play a huge part in this play. There are a lot of monologues, particularly to explain Faust himself. As this is a story about Faust, his doings, and his beliefs, it's not really surprising that a lot of text is spent with Faust monologuing to the audience about his thinking and his rationales and everything else. This is both good and bad. It's mostly good because it means that we as the audience can understand Faust himself and his rationale, and we can understand what he's thinking just before he does things. We can understand why he's succumbing to the various dealings. We can understand why he's undertaking the actions that he is. But the problem is that it's very blunt. It's very in your face. If you are the sort of person who enjoys subtlety and nuance and being able to read into things rather than having them told to you, this play is probably not going to be your favorite, because everything is made explicit. So now that we've talked about all that, let's get down to the actual story. The beginning of the play is very straightforward. It has a chorus. It starts telling us about Faust himself, giving us all the backstory about who he is and what his deal is. Essentially, Faust is a very low-born individual. He made something of himself, though, because he was very smart. He gets himself a doctorate in theology at a University of Wittenberg. Now, it is worth noting that this is an age where, if you want to practice medicine, you need to get a doctorate in theology as well. This was fairly common, and something which plays into everything else. Anyway, it is then explained to us that Faust is so interested in learning and so proud of his intellect that he is no longer challenged by mortal science and mortal theology. He needs more. He will do anything to get more, and so he begins the process of engaging in various magical acts, particularly necromancy. Faust, you see, is extremely bored, but more than that, he's extremely impatient, because you see, he is aware of his mortality, he is aware he only has so many years of life, and he doesn't know when he's going to die, so wasting time with things that are seemingly beneath him is not beneficial to him. He finds himself constantly hitting walls no matter where he goes in terms of knowledge. So he keeps doing research in the hopes that he'll discover something new, but he keeps hitting limits of what is possible. And this concept of him rebelling against what is possible leads him to conclude that he needs to study the dark arts. He needs to go into magic and sorcery and necromancy and everything else. It is worth noting that he didn't come upon this on his own, because other people have been trying to entice him to learn magics, particularly two other magicians whose name are Valdez and Cornelius, which are extremely stereotypical magical names, but they have been attempting to woo him to the side of sorcery for some time now. And so our play begins proper with Faust telling his servant Wagner to go out and seek these magicians and bring them to him. And the reason is because he wants to finally learn them. He has decided that they were right and that he needs to learn everything he can from them. It is at this point, while he's sitting there waiting for the magicians to show up, that he is visited by two angels. You can think of them as kind of like the angel and the devil on your shoulder, because the good angel and the bad angel have an argument, with both of them offering arguments for and against what he's trying to do. Obviously, the good angel, who is moral and religious and all that stuff, is like, you shouldn't learn magic, you're going to damn yourself to hell forever, hell is pretty hot right now, and you'll be tortured and burned forever. And the bad angel is like, actually, magic is wicked awesome, and yeah, you might end up in hell, but you'll also end up with lots of power and control, and you'll be able to sate your thirst for knowledge. So, it's not really answered which he's going with. Faust kind of like ruminates on these two options, because at that point the two wizards show up and essentially both together claim that, well, Faust is very smart, so if he devotes himself to learn from them, clearly he'll be able to do anything. I mean, he's clearly with his intelligence, he will be able to learn magic like no one else has. They kind of act like snake oil salesmen, being like, obviously, you can learn from us, and you will be granted all of your desires, and all these other things. At which point, we cut away, because it is now dinner time, and the play feels the need to be explicit about what is going on. So, you have Faust and the wizards who leave the scene to go eat dinner, and we cut to two unnamed scholars so that we can hear them talk about and ask about where Faust is. Wagner, obviously the servant, is like, oh, he's with the wizards. And the scholars, again, to inform the audience that this is bad, openly worry that these two crazy magicians have corrupted Faust, and they feel the need to go and talk to the guy who owns the university, the guy who runs everything, because our local scholar has turned to witchcraft and kookery, essentially. It's at this point that events begin moving very quickly, because we cut from them worrying that, oh, he's going to be corrupted by crazy wizards, to Faust summoning Satan. Or more accurately, he's summoning Mephistopheles. Now, Faust is like, aha, I've summoned a demon, and I've done this all myself. And Mephistopheles is like, actually, I came of my own accord. Actually, I decided on my own that I want to come and see you. And because, again, this play is very literal and spends all of its time telling the audience everything, he's like, by the way, I serve Lucifer. I can't do anything unless Lucifer gives his personal approval. So Faust is like, okay, I'm interested. I'm in. Let's make a deal. I want to know about Lucifer, and I want to know about hell. And I know you can't tell me that unless Lucifer gives his opinion. So what I want you to do is go to Lucifer and tell him that I'm willing to make a deal, and then come back with his answer. So Mephistopheles is like, okay, and he disappears. Then he comes back, and he's like, I got the contract, and all you gotta do is sign in your own blood. And the agreement that the two make is pretty straightforward. Mephistopheles is going to serve Faust for 24 years. After 24 years, Lucifer gets everything. He gets his body, and he gets his soul. Essentially, he's getting 24 years of a demon serving him for an eternity of being owned by Lucifer. Faust is like, that sounds like a great deal. Let's do it. So he signs it in his own blood. At which point, Faust's first request is for a wife. Now, that seems kind of odd that you get a demon for yourself, and the first thing you ask the demon is, hey, bring me a wife. It's also interesting because Mephistopheles is like, I can't do that, and also marriage is a ceremonial toy, so I can't really give you a human being. Faust is depressed about that, but he's like, okay, I want books and knowledge and other secret things that are denied to me. And Mephistopheles goes, done. And he brings him a single book. Like, only that book. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but this is a case where Mephistopheles is acting as kind of a genie-like figure, where he's granting wishes, but they're not particularly exactly what he's asking for. At this point, the whole scene shifts again, because now we're getting another monologue soliloquy thing, where the good and bad angels show up to then continue to make his case to Faustus, because Faustus, at this point in the story, is beginning to waver in terms of the deal he's made. He's like, well, it seemed like a great thing at the time, but I'm not exactly getting what I want, because I asked for a wife and it couldn't get it to me. I asked for knowledge, and he gave me a single book, so he's kind of screwing me out of all this stuff. I'm not sure my soul is worth this, because he's not particularly useful for 24 years. And obviously the good and bad angels are arguing back and forth about the various flaws and virtues of either decision. It's at this point that Lucifer himself arrives to remind Faust that he made a contract. More than that, he brings with him a procession of various demons to sort of entice Faust with various powers. Basically, Lucifer is going, hey, don't try to have the contract annulled, don't go back to God, because the problem isn't us, the problem is you're thinking too small. You are asking for things that any mortal could ask for. You have a demon at your beck and call. You have a rubber stamp from Lucifer. You can do anything. So, what you should be doing is using this to its fullest. And Faust is like, you're right. It is at this point that Faust and Mephistopheles turn this play into what is essentially a road trip comedy. Because you see, it is now time for them to tour Europe. So they go to various places and do various things, and they eventually show up in Rome, where the two of them, being invisible and having a little fun, begin to mess with the Pope. It's worth noting that at this point in time, Germany is Protestant, as is England, and they do not particularly have a lot of good feelings towards the Pope. At this point in the play, word of Faust's deeds have made their way to the Holy Roman Emperor. The Emperor is obviously not particularly glad that there's a guy running around openly showing demonic power to everybody who will, witness him. So he calls Faust to his own court. At which point, the Holy Roman Emperor basically demands, hey, show me proof that you have power. And to do this, Faust asks Mephistopheles to conjure Alexander the Great, which he then does, and Alexander the Great shows up. Furthermore, somebody in the crowd begins to heckle him, because obviously this is sinful and bad, and Mephistopheles reacts by giving the knight who is doing this horns like a devil. Now, this is the first time that the two versions, A and B, diverge. Because you see, in the A version, the original, the Emperor is like, okay, you've had your fun. Stop doing all of this stuff. It's evil and it's annoying me and making everybody unhappy. Stop doing it. And Faust is like, okay, and does so. The B version, on the other hand, presents a much longer version of this scene, because the knight who has now been given horns goes and gets his friends, who all attack Faust, and in defense of himself, Mephistopheles gives all of them horns. Which I guess was added to add a little bit of dramatic conflict to the story. It doesn't really matter because it doesn't really go anywhere. Either way, the scene then shifts again, because Faust then, for reasons that are unclear, begins to play tricks on a local horse dealer before they travel off with said horses to then go meet a duke and duchess, where they can then put on a magic show. If it sounds like the play is meandering around a lot, that's because it is. I'm not exactly sure why this needed to be 5 acts, because there's a lot of filler in the meantime where Faust is just kind of doing things without really adding anything to the plot. And I think part of that is just because at the time you wanted to show things, and because the play is very blunt and in your face, it wanted to give an idea of all the things that Faust is being tempted by. In any case, Faust realizes that it's almost time for the bill to come due. It's been 24 years, he's had his fun, but now Lucifer is coming to collect. So he begins to get his affairs in order. First and foremost, he bequeaths everything he owns to his servant Wagner, who I mentioned earlier. He also then conjures Helen of Troy for some students, which makes me think that the author had some affinity for ancient Greek figures and just wanted to throw them into his play. Although, unlike Alexander the Great, Helen of Troy actually has a reason to be in this story, and we'll get to that in a second. Because Faust has a new soliloquy/monologue that is meant to contrast the one at the beginning of the story where he was thinking about the future. Because now he's thinking about God, he's thinking about repenting, he's thinking about all the years that he's lived fairly happily, and how he got the deal that he wanted. He's thinking about the fact that he's going to be burning in hell forever, and, you know, he's rethinking everything. He's asking if it was all worth it. What's interesting, though, is that Faust decides that he has been given what was agreed to. He asked for power, he was given power. He asked for knowledge, he was given knowledge. He's enjoyed his 24 years, and so instead of repenting, he renews his pledge to both Lucifer and Mephistopheles. Now, he also asks for one last thing, which is he asks for Helen of Troy to be his lover, which admittedly is probably the worst thing to happen to Helen of Troy, even considering the fact that the entire Iliad was fought over her. In any case, Faust then goes to talk to a bunch of students and a bunch of scholars, basically everybody who's ever known him, and he tells them all that he has sold his soul to the devil, and it doesn't matter if they're praying to him, it doesn't matter if they tried to save him, he has decided to give his soul to Satan, at which point all of the devils and demons of hell come and grab him and drag him to the underworld. And that is where our play ends. That is where Dr. Faustus, the play, ends. Now, having gone through the play itself, I need to mention that I skipped over a lot of things and a lot of details, and the reason is that it's, as I said, a very in-your-face play. Everything about the play is very explicit in what it means. Very little is left to the imagination. So, for example, Mephistopheles, when he shows up, gives the audience a very detailed description of the underworld and everything that's in there. It is not left to chance that, oh, it might not be that bad. The audience is meant to understand that the underworld is explicitly a terrible place and everything is awful, and doing what Faust is doing is a bad thing. you don't want to do it. And Mephistopheles is practically like, yeah, you shouldn't make this deal, because if you make this deal, you're going to hell forever, and hell sucks, and everything is terrible. And Faust is still like, yeah, I'll chance it. This seems, this seems totally fine to end up in hell if you're going to give me all this time with magical power and everything. There's also the matter of various religious interpretations. Again, there's a lot of Protestantism going around right now. At this, not now, it isn't today, but I mean now is when the play was written. You have various Protestant factions all debating about theology and various things like that. And so the play is undeniably fairly controversial in that regard. There are other controversies mostly involving how direct everything is with its involvement of demons. Because you see, before Marlowe wrote this play, there were very few authors who were willing to write about demons, especially like details of hell, because they didn't want to get branded as heretics or demon worshippers themselves. So now that I've talked about the original play, you're probably noticing that there are lots of things missing from the version you probably know. Because usually, a Faustian bargain is one in which you don't get what you want. That's the whole concept of making a deal with the devil. You make a deal, and you think you know what you're getting, and then you don't. A good example of a Faustian bargain in fiction is, say, Ghost Rider from Marvel Comics, where a man wants to cure his father's cancer. He makes a deal with Satan, and he says, hey, cure my father's cancer, and I'll give you my soul. And the devil goes, okay, cures his cancer, and then he dies in a motorcycle accident the next day. Okay, that's like the stereotypical Faustian bargain of you make a deal, you think you get what you want, and you're screwed out of it. That is absent in the original play, because as I said, Faust ends the play going, I've gotten everything I wanted, and I'm going to hell anyway, but I don't really care because I got everything I wanted. That seems a little weird, to most of us anyway, because we're so used to future versions of this play, which we're now going to talk about. Because Faust, by Goethe, is the one that most people know. Now, Faust is written by a man named Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He is perhaps one of the most famous German poets, playwrights, critics, novelists, statesmen. He basically did everything. He was a scientist, he was a writer, he was a fairly traditional noble figure when he wrote. And that probably shouldn't surprise any of us. He lived between 1749 and 1832, so we're talking about a story that is roughly 300 years after the original play that I have already described. It's worth noting that Goethe's Faust is entirely different in terms of structure. Normally the play is broken up into two separate parts, Faust Part 1 and Faust Part 2. It's usually not done all at once. Like, you usually don't do Faust Part 1 and Faust Part 2 all at once, because it's a very long play. The play itself was written somewhere between 1772 and 1775. We're not really sure. One thing that's important is that we don't have an original manuscript of the play. The only thing we have is a copy of the play, and that was discovered in 1886. So that's the version we're working with. The other reason I should mention that it is produced and not performed all at once is because they are two separate volumes. Faust Part 1 was originally published in 1806. But Faust Part 2 wasn't finished until 1831, and it was not printed until Goethe himself was dead. And they have completely different focuses. Most of the time, what you would normally see today is a focus on Faust Part 1. The reason is that Faust Part 1 is basically the story I've already told you, with some changes that we'll get into. Faust Part 2, on the other hand, is essentially a treatise on various topics. So it's Faust in hell talking about various things in the world. So, for example, Faust talks about politics, he talks about history, he talks about human nature, he talks about magic and mysticism and theology, which all makes sense because if you think about it, this is kind of similar to what I talked about when I talked about Euripides and when he wrote his plays. When an author writes matters a lot. So Faust Part 1 is written when Goethe is younger. Faust Part 2, as I said, was written basically when he was about to die. And so you can read it as a treatise on a whole lot of things that he's thinking about right before he dies. It is ostensibly what Goethe himself has been thinking of. So I'm not going to spend too much time on Part 2. Instead, I'm going to talk more about Part 1. Because Goethe adds a lot to the play. It may be based on the story I've already told you, but he adds a lot of new elements that have not been seen before. So, for example, the play doesn't start with Faust. It starts with heaven. And we see heaven where God and Mephistopheles are making a bet. Essentially, you're adding in biblical stories. A lot of this probably sounds like it's taken directly from the book of Job, and you'll see what I mean in a second. Essentially, the setting is that Mephistopheles is like, look, I bet I can lure your favorite human being away from you. I bet I can tempt the being you love most. And God is like, no, you can't do that. There's no way that you're going to take a guy who has dedicated himself to all of the most worthy pursuits and tempt him towards evil. And so the bet is made. Mephistopheles goes off to attempt to woo away God's favorite human being, who is obviously Faust. We then move directly to Faust's study, where Faust is having a monologue, essentially decrying the fact that science and humanism and various theologies are all pointlessly vain because they're more interested in the image of being smart than being actually smart. Essentially, Faust is saying that if you try to study biology, you're being hopelessly vain because you're not learning the real truths. You're only learning what seems to be the truth, but which is not true. And so Faust, consumed by this desire for knowledge, turns instead to sorcery and magic in the hopes of discovering true knowledge. He is a reflection of the old school idea of the alchemist, for example. Now, it is worth noting in this version that's different from the version I've told you that there are no wizards to come and tempt him. There is no Cornelius to show up and be like, we can teach you things, and then disappear from the play entirely. He is doing this on his own. Now, Faust also, again, monologues a whole lot about how he feels like he's failing, despite the fact that he feels that learning about theology and science are pointless and vain, that his own attempts to learn magic are not going well. He basically feels like a failure. And trigger warning, suicide. Faust then openly talks about killing himself because he can't find true knowledge and true science. It's a little weird. In any case, despite the fact that Faust is like, well, I can't find the truth, I guess I should kill myself. He then goes, it would be a bad idea to do this because it's currently Easter. I don't know how to like explain how weird this is all like shoved together, because essentially he hears local celebrations of Easter and goes, you know what, it's Easter, I guess killing myself would be a bad idea. You know what, I'm being too rash, I need to go and clear my head. And so he grabs Wagner, who is again his manservant / assistant, and he's like, let's go for a walk and go learn things. And he does so. During his walk, however, he is followed by a dog. The dog in this case is a poodle. I'm not sure why it's specifically a poodle. It just is. Doesn't really matter because they let the dog follow them into their home, into their study. So apparently they had a dog following them, and both Faust and Wagner were like, yeah, I guess it can come in with us. We don't know who you are or anything. You can just come into us. Doesn't really matter. Because the poodle is actually Mephistopheles, who reveals himself. And he, instead of proposing a deal, he proposes a wager. So you might remember in the original story, it's a deal. You make an agreement. In this case, it's a wager. It's a bet. Mephistopheles says, look, I can grant you true knowledge. I can grant you a moment in time where you will have perfect understanding of everything. I will grant you a single moment of complete mental transcendence. I will grant you a moment where you will wish that that moment can last forever. And then, if he does this, Faust will instantly die. So the bet is, I will give you a single moment of bliss. And if I do that, if I give you a moment that you wish will last forever, you will immediately die and you will now have to serve the devil. Faust does not believe Mephistopheles. He thinks that Mephistopheles is obviously lying, and so he's like, you can't do this, I'll accept the wager. Mephistopheles realizes that Faust is the type that might try to go back on his word. So he's like, okay, look, Faust, you need to sign this pact in blood. So it's permanent, and you can't go back on it. If I do it, as I said I will, that you have to pay the piper at the end of it. At which point, Faust complains to the demon that the demon doesn't trust Faust. Which is, I don't think that's meant to be comedic, but it's a little interesting that Faust is the one going, why don't you trust me, a man who is willing to make a deal with a demon? When he himself is doubting that the demon is being honest at all. So neither of these two guys are honest, and Faust is unhappy that he's being doubted and has to sign an agreement. So they have this argument, and at the end, Mephistopheles is like, look, man, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to like go through with all this unless you sign it in blood. And Faust relents. Faust is like, fine, I will sign it with a drop of my own blood. I will do whatever you want because I know that you can't do this. Now, you may be thinking that Mephistopheles is going to go the route of the genie, or something like it. Because you remember in the original story, Mephistopheles basically goes on a road trip with Faust, and they have crazy hijinks, and, you know, they have all kinds of fun all over the place messing with people. That is not what happens. Essentially, Goethe takes a lead from the original story. If you recall, the first thing that Faust asked for after signing his agreement was a wife, and Mephistopheles said, I can't do that, marriage is silly, you should be a bachelor forever, I can't bring you a human being. In Goethe's version, Mephistopheles comes up with a scheme. Essentially, Faust goes out to do his day-to-day shopping, things like that, and we are introduced to a number of new characters. The first of which is known as Margaret, also known as Gretchen, depending on which version of the story you're reading. Either way, whatever her name is, Faust is infatuated with this woman, and Mephistopheles comes up with a scheme to help Faust woo her. So Mephistopheles, along with one of their neighbors, who I'm not sure why is included, create jewelry to give to Faust, who then gives it to Gretchen to win her heart. Slowly but surely, Gretchen falls in love with Faust, but it's made clear that the only reason that she's in love with Faust is due to Mephistopheles giving Faust game. And it should also be noted that, how do I put this? There's no real good way to put this, but Gretchen is also a terrible person. That is also made clear, because Gretchen's mother keeps trying to involve herself with her and Faust, mostly because I think her mother realizes that Faust is no good. So they use a sleeping potion, and it kills Gretchen's mother. That's one way of ensuring that the lover can meet you. So if you think of all those stories where the boy is outside of the window and being like, I want to come up and visit you, and I have to climb up the outside because otherwise your parents will know. Imagine if that was done by murdering the parents. That's how it works in Faust. At this point in the story, we are at the everything is wonderful stage, where things progress very quickly. Faust and Gretchen have a good time together. They begin to fall in love. They begin to have sex. Gretchen becomes pregnant. You may recall that they are not married, and her brother is none too happy about the fact that this guy named Faust has knocked up his sister when they're not married. In order to defend his sister's honor, I guess, he's like, I challenge you to a duel to the death. You might remember that Faust is a scientist, a magician. He is not a warrior. He has no points in strength or constitution or dexterity. So Mephistopheles helps him defeat her brother, who falls dead as a doornail, having failed to defeat a demon. Now, it is at this point that Gretchen then produces, gives birth to her kid, who is illegitimate, you might recall, because they are not married. Gretchen is so broken up about the fact that they had an illegitimate kid that she murders the child. And I know what you're saying, wow, this got really dark really quickly, and it did. This is one of those plays where it's clear that it was written by a German author, because everything is terrible and just continues to get even more terrible. It is inherently pessimistic. So yeah, she drowns her kid and is arrested and put on trial and convicted of murder. So she's going to be put to death. Now, Faust is like, I need to save the woman I love, despite the fact that she murdered our kid. I need to save her from the death, so I'm going to help her escape from prison. There's only one problem. When he goes to the prison to free her, she refuses to leave. She is like, I'm guilty, I did it, I'm horribly upset about it, I am not going to leave. And so, Faust and Mephistopheles now have to leave, which I'm assuming you could expect. What's curious is that as they're leaving, there's a voice from heaven that booms out saying that she'll be saved, which is curious, because there's a different version of this where it booms out that she'll be condemned. So I guess depending on your audience, you either forgive the woman who murdered her baby, explicitly, or you don't. One of the two. Pick your ending, I guess. And that is where Faust Part 1 ends. Now, you may recall I said that normally, when you put on this play, you only produced Faust Part 1 or Faust Part 2. And that's true, despite the fact that Faust Part 1 doesn't really end the way you would think. You're like, wait a minute, so the ending is Faust tries to free his woman that he loves with Mephistopheles. She refuses, and then God says she'll be fine or that she'll die. And that's your ending? Yes. And that was the ending for like 30 years. And then Faust Part 2 comes out. Now, you remember what I said about Faust Part 2 being a long and very uninteresting play because it's a lot of philosophy. And I wasn't lying about that because Faust Part 2 is 5 acts long. So, if you want to sit through 5 acts of Faust Part 2, you can. It's also worth noting that you could probably isolate them on their own because they're all themed. Because again, it's not really meant to be like a continuation. I mean, it is a continuation, but it's not the continuation of the original. That said, I'm now going to go through Part 2, just because I think it's kind of worth doing. Because for all of the talk of Part 1 being the important part, Part 2 is interesting, I think, in my opinion, just because it just blends all kinds of weird stuff together, and it takes concepts from the original story and applies them in weird ways. So, our play begins with Faust laying down, unable to sleep, on a bed of flowers. Kinda seems weird, given everything we've seen so far, but that's where we start out. And there are angels who essentially begin by begging for Faust to be forgiven because he is suffering and he should not be suffering this much. Given that this is meant to be a sequel to Faust Part 1, I'm not sure that's accurate, but we'll get to that. So now we move to the Holy Roman Emperor's court. You may remember from the original that at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Faust and Mephistopheles caused a stir and all kinds of crazy nonsense to occur. Fun stuff, you know? In any case, Mephistopheles has disguised himself as the fool. He is the jester. He is essentially helping the Holy Roman Emperor avoid bankruptcy. Because this is a commentary on paper money now. So, Mephistopheles saves the empire by introducing the concept of creating money. He's like, if you print money, rather than use gold, it will make people spend money, and thus, you will save the economy. Because again, this is a play that is actually talking about everything but the story of Faust, which is a little bizarre. But anyway, Mephistopheles invents modern monetary theory. Jump cut to a masquerade ball in Florence, Italy, because at this time, Florence is an imperial possession of the Holy Roman Empire. It's worth noting that Goethe had never actually been to one and didn't do any research about what they looked like. He based the entire scene and everything about it on paintings he had seen depicting it, which is a bit like if your only knowledge of what like Asia was like was by other people's paintings depicting things in Asia. In any case, Faust and Mephistopheles show up, and Mephistopheles begins to enthuse about how much he loves parties and celebrations and things like this. Then the Emperor arrives, and the Emperor is overjoyed, to say the least. He is happily enthusing and praising Mephistopheles for helping him introduce this new invention called paper money. All of the money, which is apparently adorned with pictures of a guy named Simon Magus, who you're probably not really familiar with unless you're really into the Bible, particularly Acts, because Simon Magus is a figure who gets into a fight with Peter over, like, buying official positions. So that's where you get the term simony, which is the act of buying your way into government. And you might be asking the question of, why did Goethe explicitly have the emperor put Simon Magus on the money? It's because in the play, the emperor almost immediately begins to print way too much and spend it on stupid crap, as do everyone else at the court, because Goethe has a bone to pick with the French government at the time. You see, at the time, it is currently the French Revolution, and the French Revolution printed money, and Goethe was not a huge fan of them, and so he devotes a whole bunch of time essentially calling them fools for using paper money, and he basically just hates modern monetary theory in a nutshell. There's going to be a lot of this, so buckle up, my friends. Actually, buckle up even more, because we're about to get weird. So, jump cut to Faust entering a dark, wet, cave-like realm. Now, depending on who you get the translation of, this is either described as the depths of a man's mind or the womb. Because you see, this is the quote-unquote realm of the mothers. And you might be going, why are we here? Why did we jump cut here? Well, you see, Faust has decided to find the ideal form of beauty, quote-unquote, in order to please the emperor. So, you might just imagine, like, alpha bros going, we're going to go find the ideal woman and bring her back into the rest of the world. Shock of all shocks, the ideal forms of beauty turn out to be Helen of Troy and Paris. Now, you may remember from the original story that Faust wanted to marry Helen of Troy in hell. That has all been removed. In fact, the notion that they are in hell itself has been removed because he explicitly summons the two of them from Hades. Yes, the ancient Greek underworld ruled by the guy of the same name. Things then get even weirder because Goethe once again wants to make a point about vanity. So you see, all the men at court are jealous towards Paris, and so they all begin to critique him and say he's not perfect and ugly, whereas all of the women critique Helen's appearance. At which point, Faust falls in love with Helen, and becomes jealous of her husband Paris. Now, it should be noted that Paris, husband of Helen, is like, man, all these people are awful, and we should leave. And so he immediately gets Helen, and he's like, we're leaving, bye, and attempts to leave. Faust, in love and furious, essentially sends them back to wherever it is they came from, and the whole thing just kind of ends abruptly. Again, this was Goethe trying to make a point about vanity and how it doesn't matter if perfect people showed up who were the very ideal of beauty. Jealousy would cause people to immediately critique it into the ground. And that's Act 1. We have 4 more acts to get through. So, Act 2 begins by Faust, unconscious, being transported to his house. Mephistopheles impersonates Faust and talks to Wagner, who has grown up and become extremely cynical. Faust then wakes up, they have a conversation, and a homunculus enters the picture. For those of you who don't know, a homunculus is an artificial human being, because you see, Wagner, his old servant, has become a wizard, I guess you could say, and created an artificial human being through alchemy. it is at this point that things get even weirder. Because you see, the homunculus leads Faust and Mephistopheles to Walpurgis Night. If you don't know what that is, Saint Walpurgis Night is a feast day of Saint Walpurga, who is an 8th century abbess in France. I don't understand why they do this. They just do. Then they begin to encounter gods and monsters from Greek history, and like Greek mythology and stuff. Again, I don't know why. It's a little weird how this is all going on. Try not to think about it too hard. It doesn't matter, though, because Faust, you see, is still in love with Helen and is now searching for her. And now we're kind of reenacting the Iliad, where Faust is like, I need to find Helen because I'm in love with her. So they meet a Sibyl who will tell them how to get into the underworld to then go get Helen. At the same time, Mephistopheles goes off to do his own thing, because you see he's out to go talk to the Grey Eye, which I don't know if that's how you pronounce that, but if you're familiar with the myth of Perseus and the 3 hags who pass an eye around and share the eye, that's who Mephistopheles is going to see. They also share one tooth, but that's not really important. Anyway, Mephistopheles disguises himself as one of them, despite the fact that there's meant to be 3 of them, not 4. Doesn't really matter. Anyway, the homunculus is also off doing his own thing, and this is all turning into kind of a mess. But essentially, the homunculus is like, I want to be human, and so he meets a sea god, and the sea god is telling him how to be fully human, but unfortunately, he fails, and he dies. And that was his total contribution to the story, and that's the end of Act 2. It only gets weirder from here. So Act 3 begins, and our main character is now Helen. Helen is in the palace of the king of Sparta. She's accompanied by a bunch of women who are acting as the chorus. A hideous man named Phorcys appears at the fireplace, and as is true in all Greek mythology, old, ugly men can always see the future. And he's like, yo, Helen, the king of Sparta intends to sacrifice you and all of your lady friends to the gods. Helen is obviously very upset about this, and she's like, man who is old and can see the future, please help me. And he's like, perfect, I shall take you all to Faust's fortress. How did he get a fortress? Where did it come from? What year are we in? I don't know. You can definitely tell this was written by somebody on the verge of death because it's incoherent. Doesn't matter. Anyway, Faust meets up with Helen at his fortress, and they declare love with each other. Menelaus shows up with an army. Faust defeats it, and then he's like, wow, Sparta is extremely beautiful, and now everything is perfect. If you're going, man, this doesn't make any sense, and reads like terrible ancient Greek fan fiction, you're not wrong. But I'm kind of trying to move quickly because there's a lot of nonsense to get through, and this is already a very long episode. Okay, now we transition by jump cut through time and space itself. We are now in a strange, dark area with lots of rocks. We are in the wilderness somewhere. Phorcys, the old man who could see the future, is working for both Faust and Helen. He explains to the audience, who are no doubt extremely confused, that in the past, off-screen, Faust and Helen have had a son named Euphorion. Euphorion is extremely beautiful, and he's gifted at music as anyone in Greek mythology might be if you were the son of some divine being. Apparently, he was extremely bold in his ability to fly, and he fell to his death. If this sounds like Icarus, it's because it's essentially ripped off wholesale. Some people would be kind, call it an illusion. It is not entirely sure which it is. You can choose for yourself. Anyway, he goes on and he's like, so her son died and Helen was very sad, and she goes back to hell to go and get him, because now we're ripping off the legend of Orpheus, because of course we are. There's a bunch of women there acting as the chorus, and obviously none of them particularly want to go to hell and be in the underworld, so they essentially go back to talking about how great she is. It is then revealed that Phorcys, the wise old man, is actually Mephistopheles. I don't know why he needed to become one of the Grei and then go to Sparta, where none of this makes any sense. And it's not going to make any more sense as we go through with it, because there's a lot more nonsense coming in Act 4. Jump cut to Faust no longer being in Sparta. He is now in Germany. He is looking up at the clouds, where he realizes that one of the clouds has split into two. And he sees that one is Helen and one is Gretchen. If you've forgotten who Gretchen is the woman he fell in love with in part 1, who murdered their kid and was in prison essentially to die, and who refused to leave despite that. Now, the one that is Gretchen rises upwards towards heaven, whereas the one for Helen moves eastward. Mephistopheles then reappears. He has left behind his image as the Grei, and he joins Faust again, and at this point, they begin to talk about the Earth. Essentially, they begin to blend together religion and geography, and they want to talk about where the Earth came from, where the mountains they are currently on came from, what made the Earth, all that kind of stuff. Faust, having this conversation, has come with some kind of realization of his new purpose in the world. I guess because he's moving away from all the loving. And he's like, I want to discover a new world, a new land, for myself. It's worth noting, though, that he's not doing this out of, a desire to explore. Essentially, Faust is obsessed now with controlling the world itself. He wants to find a world where he can control, the weather and the plants and everything else. So Faust begins by trying to find a way to control the sea, which, how do I put this? Succeeds? If you're like, wait, Faust can now control the oceans like he's Poseidon? Yes. Which he begins to use by making various dams and drainage places, which seems like a pretty lame way of using your power over the seas. Doesn't really matter, though, because whatever his plan is, it's interrupted because now there's a war going on between the Holy Roman Emperor and somebody else, and now we're in a completely different plot again. So Mephistopheles shows up again, and he's like, I've brought in 3 German men. Their names are, and I'm not joking, Bully Boy, Grab Quick, and Hold Tight. And their job is to suppress the revolt that's going on so that Faust can go back building dams. I'm not joking. Faust, however, does manage to fight the entire war and defeat the rebels, and the Emperor is pleased, but the 3 men turn out to be awful people, because all 3 of the men that Mephistopheles has brought to him are looting and pillaging and killing innocents. This is all meant to be allegory for the final act, but that's not important right now. What is important is that Faust as a reward for all of his wonderful military service, is given land that he is allowed to administer however he pleases. He is essentially made a noble, and it's worth noting that it is a beach. He gets to make use of all of his ocean-controlling powers. And at this point, we jump cut again, because we are in the final act. Faust is now an old man. It's a little bit weird, because we don't know how many years have passed between him being a young man and him being an old man, but given we time traveled at least once already, we'll deal with it. Anyway, Faust has used his water-controlling powers to literally create a new, like, island/patch of land, because he's pushed back the sea and he's dammed and diked the whole thing to reclaim all of this new territory which he has given to himself. Faust is also extremely greedy, because as he's surveying his land, he realized that there's a bunch of old people, and these old people are, like, living their life peacefully, and Faust is like, I don't own their house, and I'm very angry that I don't own their house, so I'm going to demand that the house be removed. Except he doesn't say, remove the house. He says, remove them. And Mephistopheles is like, done, and murders them both. At this point, he is punished by the personification of caring, who breathes upon his eyes, and he goes blind. So, essentially, he's given the Care Bear stare, and he just goes blind forever. He is then racked with horrible guilt about having these two people murdered, and he's like, I need to better the lives of all of my subjects. And when he does this, realizing that he could use all of his powers to better the lives of everyone around him, he is suddenly struck with euphoria, a eureka moment, and he gains that sheer moment of pure bliss and drops dead. No, I don't know why Goethe decided that the sheer moment of bliss that he could have is, I am blind and motivated by guilt, but I could help people, and that's all it takes for him to achieve, like, nirvana, essentially. Anyway, Mephistopheles is like, well, you lost your wager. You achieved that moment of bliss that you would want to have forever, where you're living entirely in guilt and trying to help the lives of other people, and your soul is now mine. However, angels appear. I guess Deus Ex Angels at this point, because they just show up and they start throwing rose petals at Mephistopheles and the demons who have come up to try and claim Faust, which somehow burns them. Mephistopheles, however, is like, no, I'm not retreating from a bunch of floating petals from angels. That's not going to happen. His soul is mine. At which point things get weird, because apparently the rose petals, for no clear reason, don't act as a repellent for Mephistopheles. They work as an aphrodisiac. So now he's in heat, and he's lusting after the angels, who steal Faust's soul and leave. And that's the scene. Jump cut to heaven, where we are in a multi-biosphere realm that is described as having every major like earth formation you can imagine. It has deserts, it has rocks, and forests, and rivers, and mountains, and everything you could possibly want. It is meant to be like nature itself. The angels show up, and they have Faust's soul. At this point, they begin to extol the Virgin Mary. I don't know why, they just do. various biblical holy women have revealed themselves. I don't know why, but they do, and they begin to plead for Faust's soul. I don't know why. One of the things that's important is that Gretchen, the woman who murdered her kid from part 1, is actually one of the great holy women in the Bible, and she pleads for salvation for Faust to be reborn and brought into the higher spheres of heaven, because you see, we are basing all of this on Dante's Inferno logic. In any case, the God grants their wish, and Faust is taken to heaven. I don't entirely understand where all of this has come from. I don't really understand about why he ended it this way, but he did. And on that note, I want to quote Goethe, because Goethe explains himself in a letter, and I don't see what he apparently saw in what he was writing. So, quote Goethe, ahem. I never doubted that the readers for whom I effectively wrote would grasp the principal significance of the portrayal straight away. It is time that the impassioned dispute between classicists and romantics should finally be reconciled. The principal thing is that we should properly cultivate ourselves. The source from which we do so would not matter, if we did not have to fear the possibility of miscultivation by appealing to false models. For it is certainly a broader and purer insight into and around Greek and Roman literature to which we owe our liberation from the monkish barbarism of the period between the 15th and 16th centuries. It is not from this high level that we can learn to appreciate everything in its true physical and aesthetic value, both what is oldest and what is newest. And I'm going to be real with all of you, I have no idea what any of that means. From what I can tell, he's like, I'm going to try and make modern literature mesh together with ancient literature and create a new hybrid version of the two. Which means I think he's trying to invent fan fiction, but it's confusing. None of it meshes together, and I don't know what any of it is about. And all of this is somehow about Faust, but it doesn't particularly reveal much about Faust himself, because it's so different than the original. I should also point out that he clearly wants everything to be a spectacle. He writes about how the spectacle of the play is meant to be the closest. A lot of it is just him riffing on classical mythology, and it's just, I don't know, it's very weird. It's very, very weird. And honestly, I feel like that's a good place to end this, because anything more would be going into works based around Faust rather than the story itself. The two major works, I think, are the one that I've talked about in Marlowe's original play and Goethe's Faust. I think these are the two biggest ones. I think these are the ones that everyone knows, and yet neither of them particularly match what we today would think of as the story of Faust, which is a man who makes a deal with the devil and doesn't get what he wants, because that doesn't happen in either of these two stories. And in the case of Goethe, it's extremely Greek mythology based for some reason. Like, he just took the inclusion of Helen in the original story from 3 centuries before and just kind of riffed on it, I guess. But yeah, that's Faust. If you're very confused, the best way I can put it is never let your ideas stay ideas. If you want to add Greek mythology and a whole lot of time travel and dimensional travel to your story that you're copying from a work from 3 centuries ago, go ahead and do it. because you might be remembered as one of the greatest authors that ever lived, despite the fact that what you wrote comes off as complete nonsense. Anyway, I will see you all next time. Again, if you want to see other episodes, they are available both on YouTube and on Podbean, depending on which you like. And I will see you all next time.